Welcome to this final panel of city debates in which we're going to try to tie our discussions on property planning with empirical and more policy-oriented propositions by debating issues of taxation and tax policies related to property rights. It gives me great pleasure to be moderating this panel, which includes two presentations by Maali al-Wazir, Sharb al-Nahas, who probably all the younger generation knows as Maali al-Wazir and who we know very much as a researcher we look up to and refer to. So we're very, very happy to host him to discuss his proposition for an eventual tax policy that we can implement in Lebanon. And Vincent Renard, who's I'm not going to waste actually a lot of time reading their biographies because you have them, who's an eminent researcher on the issue from a comparative perspective. He's worked extensively in many regions of the world as part of the World Bank and as a researcher too. So without further ado, because I think we all want to hear them, I'm going to give the floor to Vincent Renard, and I'm going to, play the role of a policy cop by showing you small papers when you have 5 minutes and 1 minute. So the floor is all yours. Thank you for being here.
Okay, I thank you very much for the invitation and especially for the extremely stimulating topic of putting close property, planning and taxation, which is rather scarce, and I try to say a few words, only a very broad overview because there shall be a lot of many interesting things to say. First of all, I would like to insist that land taxation is at least 30 centuries old. I found a book about Egypt 3,000 years ago with the surveyors called Harpenodapts, the only Egyptian word that I know. We are evaluating at the same time agronomic value and the income extracted from land. So I say it's very, very old. It's always located, and so books and books have been written about that. And it disappeared, it reappeared, etc. I don't make any history of that. I would like only to focus on some key points for what happens tomorrow in city planning and city management. Well, in France, only one point in the 19th century, we did not have cadastre. It was a feudal regime, and after the revolution, paying the tax was the very priority of peasants. They went to the office in order to pay the tax, because as soon as you have paid the tax, you are the right of a citizen, you are property owner. So we have to keep in mind, in France at least, and in many other countries, that paying a tax is the privilege of those who can become full citizens. So it has been reversed in many cases, but that's the basics of it. Second, a brief comment on the perception of priority. Some presentation have developed that. I would like to insist in the part of the world that I know best, which is Western Europe, the perception of property, land ownership, is very different from one side to the other. North, south, basically. For instance, the Swedish constitution says that land is the property of everybody. The only Swedish word, it's allemansrätt, which means everybody owns everything, except if you disturb, if you go in the bed of the wife of your friend or whatever. But the rest of it, this is the basic principle. And this is profoundly marking the landscape. The very open landscape of Northern Europe. Germany, to some extent, is this type of constitution and basic legislation, including a principle which seems to me very important, but we cannot introduce it in France, that you have to comply with the regulation. even very precise. Even you have a piece of land which can be developed, you have the obligation to develop. And if not, the land is passed on practically for free to the public authority. So that's completely different perception of what you have to do with a piece of land. Bon, I don't extend about that, but in the late 19th century, it was a very interesting period. The first real financialization of land, speculation, development of land and property banks, especially in France in the 60s and 70s of the 19th century. And at that time, what I say is to illustrate the intellectual confusion regarding property tax. Let's take three different authors. The pure liberal in the European sense, free market, free market, free market. Léon Walras, top economist. And he went, in France, nothing interesting, he went to Switzerland, and he was teaching in Lausanne. And in Lausanne, the price of property was incredibly high, especially between Geneva and Lausanne. And then he has written a booklet entitled The Necessary Public Property of Land. This pure market economist decided that land was an exception. Second one was interesting, Marx, Karl. As you know, the bestseller Das Kapital was published, but he never wrote anything about land property. And he has written to his friend Friedrich Engels, saying, well, Friedrich, please help me. I don't understand this question. Land is not produced, no labor value in it, and it's very expensive. So please help me. And the poor pages written in Das Kapital had been provided by Friedrich Engels. And no tax at all. And since that time, it's rather defense and illustration of small property ownership. And the third one, and I'm especially interested in it, it's Henry George. I don't know if any of you have read a booklet entitled Progress and Poverty, in which you say we have to keep property by families, by households, etc., but capital gains must be collected by public authority. I don't know if you take that in your presentation, but I understand. So this is the Georgist idea, not really implemented except in some limited number of countries, but in my opinion, that the solution which makes it possible at the same time redistribution and economic efficiency. Keeping property, but capital gains. We have to calculate capital gains, but surely you explain us what we can do with that. Bon, then the problem, what do we do with the land tax? Which is the purpose? It is not at all simple. The first is proceeds, getting money for public authority, for building roads, etc. Everybody understands. But there is always a second one, which is some redistribution between poor people and well-off people. Any land tax in the world, some progressivity, some form of redistribution. And the third objective, which is quite important, is incentive. If you want that people build, then you put an incentive in order that they sell their land. Or if you want they cultivate corn or whatever, you put a specific incentive. And my only point here is always to take care that you cannot do everything at the same time. And I can multiply with the imagination of technocrats in any Ministry of Finance everywhere. You multiply the objective, and very often you fail with several of them. Then, the basic phenomenon is, I say, a piece of land never has one single price. That's a fiction which can be useful sometimes, but basically the price of a piece of land, be it agriculture, decided in Brussels, be it development land, whatever, is its price at the moment is the result of public policy. And we have to insist on that, because if you do not take it into account, cannot be accepted. Depends on what you can build, what type of agriculture you can do, your piece of land. So when somebody says the real market price of this piece of land, this is worth zero, absolutely zero. A piece of property is a price the very day in the office of the notary when the guy is signing a check, real or wrong. That's not the problem, that's the problem of the notary. At this moment, okay, there is a price. At the moment, depending on many other aspects. So when somebody say, we publish the book with the real value of any piece of land in the country, that doesn't make sense. It makes sense at a very precise moment, but that will be changing permanently because life is going on. So change is in value the result of public policy, of zoning plans, of taxation, etc., etc. How do we take that into account? For instance, a landowner is allowed to build whatever, the next is allowed to do nothing, national park, and looking at this beautiful piece of nature, which is the consequence. How do we treat that? And I think that the key for your answer to this question, first solution, public acquisition of land. A lot of countries do that. Sweden since 1 century, Germany to a large extent, France at the moment in the Paris region 30 years ago. Many good examples, and many bad examples as well. Because the public speculator can be the worst of speculator. I can elaborate about that, but public policy is not in itself something good. It can be excellent, it can be misleading to some extent. Second solution, taxing capital gains. I understand that will be your key point. I only give an indication. It is that it depends on the style of the market. On a very tense market, the risk is that the tax be passed on to the buyer. The depends must be managed in a very precise way. Third solution, which is to some extent my preference, is annual tax, which existed, by the way, in Lebanon, I think, some decades ago, and has been suppressed. The key condition, then, is present value, that the value be reevaluated permanently. And I know so many countries in South America where I traveled extensively. The question of valuation is always present because you can do it at any moment on any piece of land. And the fourth one, which is completely misleading, but I talk about it because it's present everywhere. I think in Lebanon you have something like that. It's the notion of transferring development rights. You say planning is unequal. One property will be worth very much and the other very low. Let's create a market, and we go on Sunday on the market. I sell development rights, I buy development rights. That's following the theory of a Nobel Prize, Ronald Coase. So it's interesting. Practically, it never operates. I did a survey for OECD about United States, New Zealand, Italy, and France, and practically always failure for practical reasons, because it's very complicated to organize a market. Even the market for buying fruits and vegetables is complicated. Development rights, how can you regulate such a market? So forget it. That's what we call un faux ami, but it's now very developed. I know several countries in South America, they create this tool, which is mostly redistribution towards wealth of people very roughly. So or there is still a worse one, thank you, Madame Thatcher, entitled the poll tax. Most of you do not remember the time of Madame Thatcher. She said we are all equal with God, and so everybody has to pay the same amount of the tax. And the Scottish began, they created a movement entitled Can Pay, Won't Pay. And the Earth and Madame Thatcher went somewhere else. Well, nothing on Lebanon, you talk about that. My conclusion, in 5 points. 1 minute every, it's okay. The first one, the prerequisite on knowledge on the land markets. A good, precise, and fresh data about the functioning of the land market are really a key condition. I worked in Russia in the 90s. It was absolutely fascinating. No cadastre, no books. Everybody was doing his own evaluation, and at prices skyrocketing. Well, after came many different things, but at the beginning was a fascinating situation. Second, I repeat myself, excuse me, you do not have one objective value. Depends on the regulation, planning, zoning, etc. Attitude of neighbors, by the way. That's not my fault. And I connect to that point 4, which is when you have a very good knowledge of the market, you can practice what's called hedonic values. Well, I quote Denmark, which has no well. Denmark, you do a transaction in 1 hour, and the computer of the municipality tells you you have bought $200,000, but the computer says, no, that's $199,000, and at any moment, any transaction is introduced in the observation mechanism. You cannot contest, and that's automatic, and nobody complains. Well, that's simple, small country, not much speculation, income are equal, conditions are good. However, the basic principle of hedonic prices, which is a very simple one, nothing sophisticated, could help in the future. And now, the last one, and which is a question, it's the introduction of a carbon tax, which were heavily on the land markets in the future. I'm not a specialist of that. I'm practically sure that within 2 or 3 years, a carbon tax will have a very important influence, for instance, in countries growing biofuels or I don't know what. So it's not yet beginning. I'm living in a country which is a little bit skeptical by nature, but I think that the evidence is now going on that point. Thank you very much.